So, a while back, I ended up making a particular video about a particular franchise. I remembered back in the day when Transformers 5 came out, and being someone who's been rather disgusted and annoyed with what Michael Bay has done with this property, I thought it was a good opportunity to talk about why the fifth Transformers movie should not be seen, and how I was hoping for the day we get a movie in the series that actually managed to be exactly what we were looking for in the Transformers movie. So, what happened a little over a year later after Transformers 5 came out? Yeah, Bumblebee came out after 5 films from Michael Bay and over 10 years after this franchise became a thing.
And was it worth it?
Honestly, yes. Bumblebee was the exact movie we needed for this property, as both a good Transformers movie and a decent film on its own merit. It is an enjoyable and well done piece of work that really deserves a lot of credit. As someone who's considered themselves a fan of this franchise, from this G1 series to even some of the other minor cartoons that came out over the years, seeing Bumblebee was an absolute treat, especially given what came before. And with this movie being a few years old now, I figure it would be a great chance to discuss why Bumblebee is
Absolute best thing to happen in the Transformers movie franchise.
Let's get started.
I guess the best way to start out this video is to discuss the beginning of where this movie franchise has started. I made it actually a goal to watch most of the Michael Bay movies again. Well, at the very least, the first 3 Bay movies. Because the good news is, watching these movies again, I kind of realized there is a little bit more value to be found in the first 3 films starring everyone's favorite meme lord Shia LaBeouf. Starting with the first Transformers movie, even after all these years, I still find it to be a very entertaining little movie to watch. Yeah, it's by no means a masterpiece, and it still has a lot of bad jokes. It also takes way too long to get to the part with the actual Transformers, to the point where you really could have cut a good 30 minutes of this movie to dedicate more time to the rest of the robots in this film. Yet, this movie managed to still give a bit of a pass for me. Because for one thing, even though the movie is kind of obnoxious at certain points, the movie doesn't go all out in terms of its humor, and even gets some genuine laughs occasionally. Plus, it has a lot more effort put into it from a production standpoint. For a film based on a Saturday morning cartoon, they managed to make a movie that's huge in scale and fairly well done, with some really impressive effects and action sequence, especially for the time. There still could have been more nods to the original franchise, but it was a nice little step in the right direction. Hell, even just hearing Peter Cullen's voice as Optimus Prime and him feeling like the original character despite being a newer live action movie is just a small sign of what the series could be.
My name is Optimus Prime.
The way this movie ends with Prime looking out into the horizon and saying his final monologue.
We are here. We are waiting.
This is the kind of stuff that gets me excited and hopeful that the next movies of the series will be bigger and better. And then we got Transformers 2 and 3, and these movies were both huge missed opportunities. Revenge of the Fallen is just a huge mess of a movie that was affected by the infamous writer's strike that was happening during that time. And even after all these years, there's still so much that's wrong with this movie. The plot doesn't add up in the slightest, the jokes were much more in your face and obnoxious, and the movie doesn't even care about maintaining continuity, and also doesn't give us a proper attention to the franchise we all adore so much. As for Dark of the Moon, the third movie, in some ways I would say it's actually a little bit better, as it's not nearly as obnoxious, and also surprisingly not as big as a mess this time around from a story standpoint. Some elements that felt weak in the second movie were improved, namely the production values, and even though it still does have some stupid, obnoxious characters. I mean, whose idea was it to have Patrick Dempsey as a Transformers villain? They're not as prevalent and as extreme as they were in the second. However, Dark of the Moon suffers from a crime that makes it not as enjoyable in some regards compared to the first movie, and that's the fact that it's honestly just kind of boring. This movie just feels more of the same for the past few movies, and this is the third movie, and it doesn't feel that much different from the first film, which, considering this is for a third and supposedly final installment of this trilogy, makes this movie honestly much more dull. I mean, for as cringe as Transformers 2 is, at least it tried to have a little bit more variety to it, especially with the action set pieces. Yeah, Transformers 2 at least had that decent forest fight with Optimus Prime. In this movie, the finale is just another big giant fight in the city, which we already saw that. No, having it be in a bigger series doesn't make it new. These are robots from space. Why can't we see them fight in space? That would be so cool. But no, we get generic city fights. Oh, how fun. The real issue with all three of these movies is how they balance the Transformers and the humans in terms of what to be the focus on. Particularly with the lead. I mean, for as entertaining Shia LaBeouf can be as an actor, for better or worse, these movies do not do him justice. He just comes across as a cliche nerd character that automatically gets romped into the story because it's the standard chosen one scenario. It wouldn't be all that bad if it wasn't for the fact that we see more screen time with him than Prime and the others, and the fact that he's just not that interesting of a character. He's just an archetype with nothing really complex because being a nerdy teen that's destined to save the world is all audiences need, according to Michael Bay, because memes and funny jokes are the real appeal for these movie franchise, not because of robots and shit. But despite my complaining, Transformers 2 and 3, honestly, in my opinion, aren't that bad. Yes, they are still bad movies, like kind of really bad at certain points. But if I am being honest, they do at least feel a bit more in line with what the first film had to offer, with being a fun action film based on an 80s cartoon. And heck, the parts of the Transformers can still offer some entertainment factor, with Optimus Prime still being cool, despite him not being the main focus in the later sequels. The fights, even if some are repetitive, can still be okay. And like I said, Transformers 2 does have that pretty neat forest battle, and the movies still have some minor fun moments, including some great unintentional comedy from the end of Transformers 3.
No, Optimus!
So, to be perfectly honest, in the grand scheme of things, I actually don't think these movies are all that bad. They're not great, but they're far from the worst movies I've seen out there, despite what everyone else have said about these Transformers movies. Which is more than what I can say about the next two Transformers movies. Transformers Age of Extinction and Transformers The Last Knight are just awful. I mean, awful. In terms of quality of films, there tends to be a tier list for that. There's standard bad, pretty bad, awfully bad, and irredeemably bad. If Transformers 2 and 3 are standard bad, Transformers 4 and 5 are irredeemably awful in practically every way. And irredeemably bad movies are ones that don't care in the slightest. They're just made to make a quick buck and don't have any thought or effort put into it at all. I didn't even bear to rewatch these movies again this time because frankly, once was enough for the near 3-hour long garbage fest, which contradict themselves even more than the original trilogy, which is saying something.
Permission to speak, sir. Permission granted, old friend. Bumblebee, your voice. I have not heard it since Cybertron fell.
The human characters are even more obnoxious with generic archetypes that make me wish for Sam Witwicky to come back. There's nothing new in terms of cool set pieces. Still just the same old garbage mayhem we're used to. It contradicts itself even more so than the previous film, and even the effects look dated. And the Transformers themselves don't even save this movie, them having less time and personality dedicated to them. And even the heroic Prime is kind of this psychopathic asshole bent on killing. Yeah, these movies ruin the franchise big time. So much so that Transformers 5 underperformed at the box office.
Good.
Because we know when a franchise is at its lowest point, there will be an attempt to make amends, and fortunately, a little over a year after Transformers 5 came out, we were treated to this new spin-off movie called Bumblebee. A movie that had every sort of potential to revive Transformers and do something better with it. So, did Bumblebee make amends for the wrongdoings of Michael Bay? The short answer is yes. That's what we're going to talk about now. How this series was saved all in the hands of this one yellow robot. So let's get started by talking about how Bumblebee became the best thing to happen in the Transformers movie franchise. Fortunately, Bumblebee made its stands as a proper Transformers movie within the first 30 seconds. How, you may ask? Simple. We start out on Cybertron. Yes! After 10 long, tedious years, we finally get a decent look at Cybertron in a big-scale live-action movie, and it is glorious. This is the kind of action set piece we've wanted to see fully realized, and not only is it a full-fledged robotic war in space that we should have gotten in the second movie, I don't know how, we also see some updates to the character design. Outside of Bumblebee, most of the Autobots and Decepticons look more inclined with their original G1 design instead of what the Bay movies had to offer. Already this is a great sign because one thing that was pretty lacking in the Bay movies were the character design. They all kind of blended together with not a lot of color standing out to them and looking more disjointed in terms of their robotic structure, where here they look just like the original show, except with way more detail being in the CG. Honestly, this is fantastic to see them. They not only look better, but for the fight sequence, you can tell more who is who and which characters is an actual Autobot or Decepticon. This even reigns true for Optimus Prime, to which in the Bay movies, I didn't really have an issue with his design. It was still a relatively faithful look to Prime, and not too drastic compared to the other robots, which looked more generic. Yet seeing him more in line with his original look, that's more clean as opposed to the original overstuffed designs of the Bay films, really showcase how this film already managed to improve upon what Bay initially established. And they even still have Peter Cullen doing the voice. Isn't that nice?
You must protect the planet. If the Decepticons find it, then our people are truly finished.
However, as great as this amazing opening is, this does have a fault since it is centered around, well, Bumblebee. And we don't really get that much focus on Cybertron. Though it's still more than what we got in the previous movies, and even better yet, the rest of the movie still manages to be pretty damn good. Which is odd because it has the makings of it being a failure. We get to see Bumblebee get to Earth to help send his message from the Autobots, only for him to be deemed as the enemy and his voice to be gone. Being that Bumblebee is a quieter, more introverted protagonist compared to some of the other Transformers, it only makes sense that this story would go the E.T. route, where he finds a kid, becomes friends with him, and then they go through various hijinks while trying to fit in, and also to not get caught by the government, who deems him as a threat. Sounds all cliched, yes, but they managed to make it work. They put in effort in an aspect that I never thought could have been done so well in a live-action Transformers movie. What is that, you may ask? 2 words. Charlie Watson. Bumblebee manages to do the impossible. They actually have a leading character who's a human in a live-action Transformers movie that's actually likable? Yeah, Charlie Watson is a character that is so much better than she has any right to be. In fact, I may go as far as to say that she may be the best protagonist in the entire Transformers franchise, in regards to human characters, that is. Nothing against some of the other leads in some of the other Transformers shows, but there was more thought and effort going into this character than most things from this franchise that were always more so an afterthought. The best way to discuss why she works so well and much better than the previous lead is to compare her to our other leading meme lord back in the first 3 movies, Sam Witwicky. Now, Witwicky, this character honestly kind of sucks. And it's not so much because of Shia LaBeouf's performance. He does an adequate job for the material he's given.
The issue is that the material he is given isn't that good.
Because for most of the movies, we just hear him scream, yell, and run around, being kind of a hopeless damsel in distress to some extent.
Bumblebee! Bumblebee! Remember, what's no? Wait! Bang! Are you? Where is she?
But even taking out the parts where he constantly yells, the character is still lacking, mainly because his involvement and motivation with this franchise is uninteresting. First movie, he's the typical high school who wants to get with Megan Fox. It's something that's very tired and cliche, which I know this is more so for the dude bro audience, but that doesn't mean seeing this stuff isn't all to see again and again and again. Even in the sequels, this character doesn't excel much further outside of his occupation status, going from high schooler to college freshman to intern as a new job. But personality-wise, he stays the same. Socially awkward, worse version of Scott Pilgrim, and considering that these movies set the focus on him, makes it so much worse. Not only is he not an interesting leading character, but he takes so much away from what most fans want to see in these movies, which is Optimus Primes and the other robots. Now, Charlie Watson doesn't have this issue, because as we established earlier, Bumblebee doesn't take 45 minutes to introduce the Transformers to us. I mean, we get a great amount of Transformers action before she's introduced, and when she is, she proves herself to be a very likable protagonist. One thing, she is a character that is dealing with something much bigger than trying to get a high school relationship.
I mean, yes, there still is a love interest involved,
But it's pretty downplayed compared to all the moments with Megan Fox and LaBeouf. The main conflict that Charlie Watson is dealing throughout this movie is the loss of her father, and she's not entirely over it, while some of her other family members are trying their best to move on.
This includes Charlie's mother, who is trying to move on by simply dating another man in their life.
Yet, of course, Charlie feels it's way too early for them to move on so soon, since she's still hurt by the loss herself. Now that's already more interesting because we get a sense of passion and love this character once had.
So we already want to see things look up for her.
And they do, as she ends up getting a new car, which ends up being, well, obviously Bumblebee. And it is typical, yes, but in this case it works a lot better, mainly because Bumblebee himself is an enjoyable character that isn't reliant on dialogue. Yeah, they have him have a voice early on, but for whatever reason, the Bay movies decided to make him talk through the radio because
Satellite radio. One digital cable brings you
Broadcasting system. That's funny.
even though they've been incredibly inconsistent about it in every movie. Of course, with it being kind of a prequel, they had to include it, but this time they made it get less obnoxious, as he still managed to be an expressive character. The radio jokes are more regulated to actual song references, where in the Bay movies, it was more so just random movie references and other stuff outside of songs. Plus, we also get this.
Brave volunteer.
I see. I didn't do that. I
You
didn't
got
actually-
the touch. You got the power.
B is fine, but more so what makes this movie work is how Charlie interacts with B. She's not just there as some chosen one in the same way Witwicky was, but instead she's a character that just happens to be ramped up into this situation. Which, again, makes her more relatable, as even with Wiki being tied to the savior of the Transformers was still kind of tiring to this point.
She manages to have fun with Bumblebee while also learning about his powers.
And even manages to help out during the action sequences as well, instead of just, well, mostly screaming the whole time.
Optimus!
It makes her a much better character because we're seeing her learn to accept change and try to move on from tragedies thanks to a lot of the help Bumblebee gave her. Which may sound typical, but since we got a decent amount of time with her and the interaction between her and Bee seems much more genuine, I really don't mind it in this case. Plus, I really shouldn't talk about her without mentioning what a great performance Haley Steinfeld gives in this movie as Charlie Watson. She has proven herself to be a very talented actress before this, but I think there are moments in this movie where she gives it her all. Particularly, there's a scene earlier on where she's talking about her father's death and how his passing really affected her.
That tape. That was the last time I saw him. He died of a heart attack. I never even got to say goodbye.
Watching this scene, she's really showcasing some true emotion here, making this character much more believable that this was something that truly impacted her. Watching this moment, I'm like, wow, she's putting so much effort with her acting talent, and I'm actually kind of feeling something when she's talking about all the great times she had with her father. Like, this is from a Transformers movie? The same series that gave us this?
I am directly below. The enemy scrotum.
Yeah, Charlie Watson is the core heart of Bumblebee, and I'm glad because I've always wanted a film in the series where I don't despise the human characters. Which reminds me, for as good as Charlie is, there are other elements in this movie that really stand out.
Even though Bumblebee and Charlie Watson aren't the highlight of the movie easily, there are a decent amount of characters that should be mentioned, and I think for the most part they serve their purpose pretty well. Let's start with America's other favorite meme lord, John Cena. Cena kinda serves as the main antagonist, as he's the main government guy that these movies tend to have. You know, the Kent Mansley of this kind of story. So he comes across as a bit of a cliche, but he still does a pretty good job with this role here, since Cena does know how to have fun with this kind of character. And you can tell he is because he's trying to embrace the fact that, well, this character is kind of a cliche, and he even makes fun of some of the other characters for being so stupid on certain things. I mean, after all, he is the one to have this line right here.
They literally call themselves Decepticons. That doesn't set off any red flags?
So clearly, he's trying to be a parody of this cliche,
as opposed to just being that one type of cliche archetype. And he overall makes for a pretty funny character. Also in this movie, while we're on topic, we do also get to see Charlie's family, and as I mentioned earlier, there is a love interest, and they're both serviceable. As in, I don't find these characters particularly that interesting. They're more so cliche than John Cena's character, and they don't really have a whole lot of time dedicated to them. However, that's kind of the reason why I tolerate them more here than I do in the other Bay movies, because they don't overstay their welcome, and their dialogue isn't nearly as cringe as the other movies' side characters had. I mean, keep in mind, we had to put up with this. Plus, I think they work for this movie. The actors do a fine job playing them, and they play off against Steinfeld very well. And they even have a few fun moments, like this particular car crash sequence dealing with Charlie's family. That's actually pretty funny.
That was radical.
I never go back to this movie for these characters, but at least unlike the Bay movies, they're tolerable. Though enough about the characters, because that's really all we have now. There's a few other things we need to discuss here, mainly the effects and the action sequences, which I have to admit, they're both an improvement and also a downgrade from the original trilogy. I say this because the CGI in this movie doesn't really impress all that much. At least, not in the same way the first Transformers movie did back in 2007. And this could be due to a few factors. Mostly the fact that CGI has come such a long way since the first Transformers movie, and seeing these movies don't really impress anymore, considering that we have seen so many movies nowadays with so much better effects. And the fact that, again, this is a smaller budgeted Transformers movie, so we don't really see a whole lot of CGI outside of Bee and some of the other Transformers robots themselves for most of the movies. The CG is used pretty sparingly compared to the other Bay movies, but again, this isn't necessarily a mark against the film, because in some ways is an improvement, with 4 and 5 being CGI overload with literal CGI garbage on screen. I'm pretty thankful that this movie does not go overboard with its effects. And like I said earlier, the designs of the Transformers here are so much better with them looking more like their G1 counterparts. And while we're on the topic, the action in this movie is pretty solid too. There's not anything huge in terms of battles, but I would say that's for the better because we've seen a billion city battles at this point and it's getting really tiring for the series. The real main action sequences are the ones in Cybertron and the warehouse battle near the very end, which does serve as a decent final set piece. And with these characters having more distinctive designs that help differentiate one another, the action scenes are more emotionally investing. And even during these sequences, we see more often than not the Transformers actually, transform it into vehicles mid-battles, which isn't that the whole appeal of Transformers to begin with? Robots transforming into things, which makes these battles not only fun, but more appropriate and fitting for the series as opposed to the previous movies having an reliance on just being overkill on CGI. But if we're going to mention a few weak points in Bumblebee, I think the biggest downside with this movie does kind of deal with what this movie is at its core, and the kind of movie that it is. As I mentioned earlier, this is still a weak man's Iron Giant, as in it's still the kind of movie that Iron Giant strives to be. And because of that, we do see again a lot of the cliches we're used to seeing in a lot of these kind of movies like Iron Giant, Lilo and Stitch, or E.T. This is still the kind of movie where we see a creature from outer space going to Earth and befriending the kid. And we see all the cliches of them trying to hide the creature, the government wanting to get the creature for their own gain, main kid having family issues, creatures from the alien planet coming to Earth to chase after the getaway alien, freakouts done by other characters when they see the aliens for the first time, and all of that here is done fine. It doesn't destroy the movie. In fact, some aspects like the family drama is done better here thanks to Watson as a character. But it can make the movie feel a bit more cliche. Some of these sequences where we have to see Bumblebee do whatever crazy shenanigans these movies tend to have or the alien creatures to do can feel a little bit like filler. These are the parts I see myself losing a little bit of interest. Another minor thing I low-key kinda like but find super odd in this movie is that people actually sort of die in this. And they die rather brutally as they explode, but they explode with this weird liquid and not blood. Is there something I'm missing here? I mean, it's still hilarious to see this happen in a movie like this, but it's still kind of odd to see. Regardless, those flaws are very minor to me, and the good is what makes this movie really awesome, in my opinion. So surely, with a film doing everything better than what has happened in every movie prior in this franchise, this is bound to be the next big box office smash. The film to break records as a part of a $1 billion franchise. That's bound to happen, right? Right? So, even despite how good this movie actually is, Bumblebee was unfortunately not a big financial success for the series. Not necessarily a bomb, since it has made its money back, and again, wasn't nearly as expensive as the previous movie, so it doesn't come across as a financial failure like Transformers 5. But it only made around $400 million worldwide, which is the lowest grossing Transformers movie. It is certainly insane, but how may something like this happen when Bumblebee was considered such a good film, especially for this property? People may claim that the weaker success was due to a number of reasons. Some say it was the fact that Transformers 5 was so bad, people felt franchise fatigue and didn't want to sit through another movie even if it was good. Some may say it was because this movie was marketed more towards a younger audience compared to the Bay films. And while I do think there are some validity to these claims, I think there is more so one big reason to why I think Bumblebee didn't perform that well. It all comes down to something pretty simple, and that's the release date. To give you a good idea, Bumblebee has an appeal of an action-adventure movie that's good for kids and older audience, and the other Transformers movies try to be the same kind of thing. So it only makes sense for them to release this new Transformers movies on Christmas? Oddly enough, Bumblebee was a winter release film, which, if you ask me, is the main reason why this movie didn't do so well as the other Transformers movies. To me, this movie does not scream winter release at all because it's not really full-on family appeal as other major movies that are released around this time, nor does it go as big or grand as other December releases in the past decade. It seemed oddly too big yet too small because it is a movie that's not nearly as grand as the other Transformers movie, but still trying to have that sort of appeal. For me, this does not scream December release. And to make matters worse, Bumblebee came out at a very competitive December, as it came out right around the same time as both Aquaman, Mary Poppins Returns, and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Considering that lineup, this might have been too much to Bumblebee to handle. And this isn't me saying that all these movies are better, because of the 4 movies, Bumblebee is easily the second best of the bunch. However, these movies were more the type of movies we're used to seeing in Decembers, and to some extent had maybe a little bit more family appeal. You could make the argument that Transformers is a toyetic franchise, to the point releasing it on Christmas would be fitting, but I'm not sure. It's kind of a stretch for this kind of movie. Transformers would still have been popular this holiday season if this movie came out any other time. To me, this movie should have been released sometime else other than winter. If this was released in like March, April, or hell, even August, I feel a smaller semi-blockbuster would have been much more appropriate around those time periods. However, I can't say it's all bad. I mean, Bumblebee still made money, and plans for future Transformers movies are still set to be in relation to this film, and I think we owe it to that fact that this movie wasn't that big of a blockbuster. It wasn't nearly as expensive, and I think the team behind this movie used their money wisely to make a better movie overall. So, it gives me hope that they'll still go to this route and then eventually give us another big, grand Transformers movie. And hey, considering how much people like Bumblebee, and whatever Transformers movie after this is just as good, if not better, then maybe we can make it so we get even more great Transformers movies later on. So this is just a reminder to see the next Transformer movie if it's good, because damn it, we need more good movies like this for this series. So, even despite not having that huge of an impact that we're used to seeing from this franchise, I think Bumblebee's overall receptions to both critics and the Transformers fan community more than makes up for it. Is it the absolute best blockbuster of this caliber? Not quite, since, as I mentioned, it does have some minor fillery moments that make it more in line with the kind of film, since it still is a weaker Iron Giant. However, for every single little improvement they actually accomplished and fulfilled in this movie makes me not only respectful of this movie, but also excited for the future of this franchise. Bumblebee is a movie that I am confident to say that it is fully great, instead of just being a guilty pleasure like the 2007 movie. Seeing what they were able to do with this franchise properly and actually have an engaging stories with characters to actually be invested with, instead of just a mindless action fest in this movie alone, really makes me wonder how else they will improve from even this movie. Bumblebee marked the beginning of a new era for the Transformers movie series, as it's still the best thing to happen to this movie franchise. With them planning a potential sequel and more spin-offs, just makes me hope they can stay consistent for future adventures with the Autobots and Decepticons. If you are a Transformers fan and you still haven't seen this movie, you should owe it to watch Bumblebee. It's the movie Transformers fans absolutely deserve. Even if you're not a fan of the series, it's a fun movie to check out, as it has enough character and action to hold your attention, and it could be seen as a good standalone thing separate from what we had prior. Thank you so much, Bumblebee, for giving Transformers a future to potentially look forward to, and I will be there for that future.
The blood, it's in the will, it's in the